Hello! Once again, welcome to the continuation of our story. With this book, Tales of the Soul's Conquest of Evil, we are delving into the 4 romances of the King Arthur cycle. And today we conclude the romance of Lancelot with this final story, The Knight of the Cart. Next week we will have Merlin. Don't miss it. A very important part of the Arthurian cycle is the story of Merlin. Today, we are going to tell a very interesting episode from the story of Lancelot. Understand that the foundations of knowledge about the Arthurian cycle are numerous. There are several authors, from a Chrétien de Troyes to a Geoffrey of Monmouth to a Wolfram von Eschenbach to the Lancelot Grail cycle and many more sources. And these sources sometimes give a different tone to the same myth. You'll see that Lancelot himself, from one source to another, from one story to another, varies a bit. In this episode, The Knight of the Cart, he shows himself to be nobler than ever before. He is that savior knight who rescues life from the clutches of death. Guinevere here is playing the role of the Great Mother herself, the Lady of Life, who, at a certain point, is imprisoned in the realm of death. And it's a vital issue. She must be brought back. It is one of the great obstacles, one of the great trials in a man's life, for those who seek to attain wisdom. It's about confronting death itself, rescuing your soul from the darkness, with all the symbolism that this implies. So here, he has a more glorious role than in all the other stories we've seen. He is no longer that gallant knight, but one completely overtaken by passion. He is a man, yes, passionate, but passionate about life itself, who is duty-bound to fight against death and rescue her. So, this story tells that, at a certain moment, at the Round Table, the same initial motif would always arise, which is the arrival of a strange knight at King Arthur's court, with exotic requests, with different demands. This knight, then, very well armed, with impeccable armor, enters King Arthur's court and says that he had with him several knights and ladies of King Arthur's court who had been imprisoned by him, and that he did not intend to release them from his kingdom, no matter what King Arthur did, and that he certainly would not see these men and women of Camelot again before his death. That's already an intriguing clue, because why would he see them later? This night we will find out. Later, he was the prince of the kingdom of the dead. Malignant. So he withdraws in this manner, and King Arthur, already somewhat disheartened, says, "Well, what we cannot change, we must have the honor to endure." This phrase is quite interesting, that is, dignity, if I can do nothing about it. Or lament it, I will be sorrowful, but I must be able to endure it. And the knight was already withdrawing, was already leaving, when at the door he stopped, turned back to King Arthur, and issued another challenge. "But if one of your knights, the best among them, is able to accompany me along with the queen to a certain point in the forest and win, in the role of defending the queen, he will be able to free those knights and ladies who are imprisoned in my kingdom." Until then, nothing had been said about it being the realm of death. Well, with this challenge, King Arthur begins to imagine who would be the knight capable of such a task. But before he can make a choice, the Knight Kay volunteers. You see, the Round Table, once you had been a great knight, as the years went by, you did not lose your place. There were other ways to serve the Round Table. But Kay felt quite humiliated, because there were several younger knights who were capable of much more daring feats than he was, as he had aged. Naturally, he didn't have the same physical vigor. He decided to use this occasion as a way to redeem himself, to regain glory, and immediately volunteered to rescue the queen. Since King Arthur owed him a favor, he had asked that whenever he requested something, it would be granted, and King Arthur had committed to fulfilling one of his requests. He couldn't refuse. Although this was reckless, because Kay no longer had the physical condition necessary for a challenge of this magnitude. But so it is done. Kay, then accompanied by the queen, goes to a certain point following that strange knight. And Gawain approaches King Arthur and says, "Look, let's all go after them, all of us. It's a short distance, because if he is not able, we can intervene." And so King Arthur proceeds, with great concern, because Guinevere represented the soul, the life of the kingdom. He was the spirit, she was the soul, his manifestation on earth. The counterpart, as there are so many mythologies, the lady and the counterpart of the knight, together they form one. And she was the life of Camelot. So it would be terrible to lose Guinevere. So Arthur goes after them, along with his knights, but at a certain moment he only sees Kay's horse, injured, running away. They rush to the spot, but there was no one there anymore. There had certainly been a battle there, in which Kay was defeated. And both he, the queen, and his challenger, all were taken, all disappeared. In this situation, Gawain, with all his well-known courage and bravery, takes 2 horses, so that on the way back, Kay and Guinevere could ride them, and sets off in pursuit of the fugitives, with the queen kidnapped. And he gallops at full speed, trying to follow the tracks left by a group of people, when suddenly he spots a knight who was on a severely injured horse. The way he was, in armor, he doesn't recognize this knight. Later, he realizes it was Lancelot himself. Then he doesn't identify himself. He simply asks Gawain to lend him a horse, and Gawain immediately obliges. He dismounts, takes a new horse, and charges ahead. Gawain can't keep up with him. Eventually, Gawain reaches a certain place and sees the horse he had lent. It had been taken down. And shields, swords, signs that there had been a battle there and that Lancelot had been victorious in that fight, had moved on. Only then does it get interesting, as Lancelot had to continue on foot because his horse was struck down. Only then does Gawain manage to catch up with him. And then, when he gets close to the knight, he sees that he is already climbing onto a cart driven by a dwarf. And this is quite an interesting aside. Today, we don't really have a sense of what it is. They were left on one of those carts, and because this involved so much shame. This type of cart was used to expose a bandit, a murderer, a thief, someone who had committed a crime either before being executed or before being banished from the city, from that village. So it was a great dishonor to be inside a cart. A good man would never do it, much less a knight. An armed knight with a sword and shield was a very respectable figure, held in high honor within the social system of the time. This means he had been victorious in many battles. He had the right to have a shield with his symbol. A knight would never enter a bandit's cart, a cart that at that time was a symbol of disgrace. But Lancelot, when he arrives at that place, at that crossing, he sees a dwarf passing by, driving a cart of that kind. And he asks if this dwarf had seen a queen pass by, the Queen of Camelot, being taken somewhere. The dwarf said he hadn't seen anything, but if Lancelot got into his cart, he would take him to a place where, the next morning, he would receive directions of where to go. And so, he still thinks for a moment, feeling ashamed, and this is one of his trials. Because the honor of being a Knight of the Round Table was something earned with great effort. With much merit, to suddenly be exposed like that in dignity, it's ridiculous. He hesitates for 2 steps. Chrétien makes a point of emphasizing this fact quite a bit. He hesitates for 2 steps. This will cost him dearly later. But after hesitating for 2 steps, he immediately climbs in with his shield and sword and sits inside the cart. And he agrees to be pulled by that dwarf, going through all the paths, being humiliated, being mocked by everyone who saw that ridiculous scene of a knight sitting in a cart. He accepts this. Gawain, who comes behind, says, "I would never do that, never, I will not submit to such dishonor." And, for this reason, Gawain will not be worthy to enter the realm of death to rescue life. He still doesn't have the merit for this great mission. Lancelot then goes with the cart, passing through all the places, until they reach a certain place, like a tower, where he gets down and Gawain also dismounts. Both are welcomed. and inside they were told they could spend the night there. They are taken to a room. In that room, there were 2 simple, narrow beds, and 1 large bed, very comfortable. Let's say a luxury bed, a bed fit for a king. And the lady, the maiden who welcomes them in this tower and takes them to their quarters, says, "Look, that is a dangerous bed, only those with merit lie in it." Gawain is not willing to undergo this kind of trial of merits. He immediately goes to a simple bed, falls asleep there, and sleeps very well the entire night. But Lancelot doesn't think twice. He goes to that dangerous bed, lies down there, disarms himself, removes his armor, and lies comfortably, as if nothing is happening. In the early hours of the morning, a very sharp spear falls upon him, and on its handle, a great blaze of fire. This spear doesn't. It hits him squarely, just grazing his skin, and when he wakes up, he puts out the fire, because the fire engulfs the entire bed. He extinguishes the fire and throws that sword far away, and he continues sleeping, as if nothing had happened. Gawain doesn't even wake up, nor does he know about this feat. But now Lancelot's trials are being processed. First, he faces a serious trial in the cart. And perhaps you don't realize the importance of this. The trial of the cart is a testament that he let go of his fame, of his recognition, of his vanity, in pursuit of his love for the rescue, for the fulfillment of his mission. It's the very conception of courage that is classically used, which is courage, like core, heart. The man who goes in search of his heart is capable of overcoming any difficulty that stands in his way. Plato mentions in a Socratic dialogue that a hero also comes from eros, love. Although this doesn't align with the etymology, the current linguistic study. But Plato said that a hero is only a hero because, on the other side, there is something he loves. And Lancelot loved Guinevere passionately, the lady of his soul, the lady of life. This makes him let go of his vanity, of his recognition, although he hesitates for 2 steps and then goes through a trial of courage, which is this bed that only sheltered the nobles. He has the courage to face adversities to prove his nobility. There is a Zen story, which I find very good and interesting, that explains this passage very well. It is said that there was a master in a monastery who was known as the wisest in all that land at that time. And the prince of that land really wanted to be accepted by this master as a disciple. And the prince was truly a very generous person. There was no poverty, there was no hunger in that kingdom. And the prince would place himself at the feet of that master, always waiting for an opportunity to become his disciple. On one occasion, he approaches the master and says, "Master, today I heard about selfishness." What is selfishness? The master seizes this occasion to put him to a test. Pretend to be furious, turn red, with an angry appearance, frowning, and say, "What a ridiculous question, what a stupid question. How can you be so foolish to the point of asking me that question?" And with that, the prince jumps up and says, "What do you mean? How can you treat me like this? Who do you think I am? You're not talking to just anyone, you're talking to the prince." Then the master smiled and said, "See? That is selfishness." In other words, the prince was truly generous, but he was willing to give away the things he had, not the things he was. He was willing to give away material things. The respect he felt he deserved for being a prince, the pride and vanity of being in a position where no one could attack him, the honor of feeling superior to others, in other words, the possessions on the emotional plane he was not willing to give up. The possessions in the realm of vanity he was not willing to give up. It's quite interesting to notice, because when a person is seeking wisdom, seeking unity, they begin to shed everything that limits them. So it was with Ulysses, who loses everything. When he emerges completely stripped in the waters, he sees Ithaca on the horizon. Life gradually strips us of our sense of possession. Possession of material things, not that we shouldn't have anything, but we shouldn't be slaves to things. possession of emotional and mental things that make us think we are superior to someone else. And if you give in to this, if you start giving it away, soon it will ask for even higher things. Possession of any feeling of spiritual superiority, of any vision that makes you feel better than others, as Pelin Blavatsky says. Spiritual vanity is the worst of all. But anyway, every time life asks for something and you say no, it will respect that. But that is your size. A man is as big as his generosity. You to find your stature there. So Lancelot is tested to see if his image as a knight of the Round Table, his recognition, his exposure, total humiliation and dishonor in all realms, was more significant to him than fulfilling his mission. And, despite having a slight hesitation, he gives in. He gives everything that life asks for. His mission was greater than everything. You see that Gawain, on the other hand, is being defeated in these trials. He feels noble enough to sit on the bed of the nobles, to sleep in the bed of the nobles. If he doesn't trust in his nobility, if he doesn't have enough courage to face the obstacles, then by asserting his nobility and his worth, he also wouldn't be worthy. And so the trials continue. It's almost like a process of initiation, a process of shaping a man to achieve the completion of a grand work, which is the conquest of his own soul. The rescue, as the Greeks used to say, the greatest art of man is to steal moments from Chronos for God. Stealing moments from time for eternity. What move? What was she doing? It was a kind of journey against death. In other words, against everything that death is capable of devouring. He was leaving behind all the things that death is capable of devouring. To seek an ever more fulfilling life that goes beyond all circumstances. When they awaken, they find a maiden who tells them that there are only two paths to the kingdom they seek. One path, both were terribly dangerous. But one of these paths was a bridge that went underwater, at a distance such that the water below and the water above were of the same volume, of the same height, and there was a strong current. It wasn't a desirable thing, but it was easier than the other. The other was a bridge that no man had ever crossed, because it was simply a razor-sharp sword, balancing over a mighty, dangerous river, an abyss where, at the bottom, there was a very perilous river. And no one had ever dared to face that one. Lancelot, out of chivalry, lets his companion choose first. And Gawain automatically chooses the water bridge and heads that way. Lancelot then begins to ride towards the sword bridge. But he didn't imagine that the path would be so long. He will spend a good amount of time riding. Then, after riding for a long time, when the sunset appeared, the sun began to hide. Lancelot, very tired, needed a place to rest. A very beautiful lady appeared, who introduced herself to him and said that he would go with her to her castle. There he could be fed, could rest, but her condition was that he spend the night with her. Spend the night with her. And he immediately refuses. She says, well, then it's impossible. He realizes that if he didn't go with her, he would die there, because there was no other place where he could regain his strength. Eat, rest, to continue his journey. So he ends up agreeing. He goes with her. Upon arriving there, he discovers that there was a very aggressive and inappropriate suitor for this lady. He fights this man, defeats him, and frees the lady from this inconvenience. He dines with her, and then she takes him to the room, where he lies down on the edge of the bed, facing outward. At no point does he approach her, nor does he get close to her. At some point, she thinks, well, this knight is struggling with a very serious problem. I will get up, I will let him rest the whole night. Peaceful, alone, in that bed. He has his trials. I don't want to disturb. And so she gets up and leaves. Then he overcomes another trial. The trial of lust, the trial of easy pleasure, the trial of a rest that would make him impure and unworthy to continue his journey. He is so focused on his goal that he is not capable of, along the way, doing anything that contradicts the moral conditions he needed to get there. In other words, the ends must be consistent with the means. Not just any means lead to the ends. This is anti-Machiavellian. Means and ends must be consistent, because otherwise these means won't lead to the ends you expect. He knew he couldn't create contradictions. He wouldn't be pure enough. The next day, then, he continues walking, and at some point he passes by a church where he sees some strange inscriptions. There were the names of several knights of the Round Table, like Olwen, like Gawain, saying that here one day they will rest. Olwen, Gawain, and other knights. In other words, they were tombs, tombs of the dead, future ones. That was already the entrance to the realm of death. And then an elderly man, a kind of priest, comes from there, welcomes him, and says, "Look, here, all these knights will rest one day." Now there is this sarcophagus. Magnificent that you have a mission, you must remove its lid. Lancelot looks, and it was a huge coffin. Heavy, he starts wondering who will be buried inside, who will be entombed there. And the priest does not tell him, says that this is not the moment, you cannot see this. It was Lancelot's own coffin. But he says, "Look, if you manage to remove the lid of this coffin, you will be able to free the men and women of King Arthur's court. Everyone will be able to return to Camelot with you." And it was thought that this would be an impossible task, because it was extremely heavy. Several men had already tried and failed. And Lancelot, with great ease, goes there and removes the lid. And that priest is very surprised by this. And the people of the earth rejoice, knowing that their liberator is there. It's interesting for you to notice, because it's not that Lancelot was endowed with extraordinary strength. He wasn't Hercules. But, in truth, the weight of that lid had already been paid with the trials he had overcome along the way. The effort had already been made. There was the reward for the effort. Just like at the beginning of the story, King Arthur, when he pulls the sword from the stone, his purity, his merit, his dignity, had already gathered the conditions for him to draw that sword from the stone. There it was simply the consequence, the culmination of the consequences of who he was. So Lancelot makes no effort and very easily removes the lid of that coffin where he himself. One day he would be buried. And when he does this, the knight then points him in the direction of the sword bridge. And the people he passes by shout that he is their savior, he is their redeemer, he will bring them back to the kingdom of life. In a certain way, what happened there was that Lancelot freed from the tomb that which is immortal within him. When we are very unconscious, our immortal soul is trapped in our body inside a coffin. Inside a prison of stone, inside a prison of matter. When we are able to leave everything behind, there is an old, even a children's story, about a knight who shed 7 cloaks along the way. In a certain way, it's the same story. How was he able to leave everything behind? His social vanity, his love for life, his weaknesses, he left it all behind. At that moment, he was in a state of freedom. To free your soul from the prison of matter. And when he does this, it is hope for all of humanity. Those who are trapped can also set themselves free. So everyone greets him as he passes by, and he then heads towards the sword bridge. When he arrives, it's something unimaginable, because it's a great, razor-sharp sword, raised over an abyss, where, down below, the river roars dangerously. It was a river that gave no chance to anyone who fell in. And on the other side of the bridge, there were 2 majestic lions, waiting for anyone who made it there. It was something that intimidated anyone who still had any attachment to this side. Life itself, some fear of something, whether it be the air, the earth, the water, or the fire. All 4 great dangers of life were present there. The lion, representing fire, earth, air, water, everything there challenged him. And he doesn't think twice. For Lancelot, there is no alternative. He cannot be alive without fighting for the Queen's liberation. For him, this is an axiom, a mission that accepts no procrastination or excuses. As long as he is alive, he will fight. In other words, this determination makes him a hero. Eros, love, will carry him over all the abysses. Courage, cor, the heart, his heart is at the feet of this lady of the world. And he just has to chase after him. So he throws himself. First he removes, he prefers, interestingly, he removes his armor. He takes off all his protections because he fears he wouldn't be able to grip the blade, to hold onto the sides of the sword, if he were fully armored with metals. The only way for him to balance there would be to place his hands and feet on the side of the sword. And so he goes. The sword is razor sharp, and several times he almost loses his balance. Several times he cuts himself and reaches the other side, very injured. Very injured, but alive. He arrives and collapses on the other side. When he looks, where are the lions? They had disappeared. It was just a test. What we see from afar looks like a lion. When we got there, sometimes it was just an illusion, sometimes just a shadow of some object fluttering in the wind. But he needed to make this crossing. As Don Quixote, by Cervantes, used to say, the giants always disguise themselves as windmills. So, in a certain way, in this case, the windmills were disguised as giants. But they returned to their reality because he was not afraid. He faces all the trials, and, on the other side, many of them turn out to be mere illusions. From the high window of the castle, there was a grand castle of the Lady of Death. 2 men watched his feet. The king of those lands, who was King Bedemigu, was considered a very noble king, a very virtuous, very just king. And his son, who was Maleagant. Unlike him, Maleagant was completely corrupt. Unjust, he had kidnapped Guinevere and was capable of all sorts of schemes to get what he wanted. It's interesting because this reminds us of another episode, when we saw that Pelin, King Pelin, had a completely venomous brother. Bad character, and yet he maintained this relationship. For some reason, this negative aspect is a test for those who wish to reach the king. Before that, you have to overcome this last obstacle, this final test. It's the portal. Inside, you have the Holy Grail. Inside, you have Aladdin's wonderful lamp. But there's one last test, the final portal, which is this alter ego of the king, this negative and shadowy aspect. That will ensure the purification of the last shadows that still exist in that hero who intends to pass through. So, Lancelot, with all his wounds, prepares himself, gets ready in the best way possible, receives armor, and fights with Maleagant. And he defeats him, but doesn't kill him. Maleagant leaves, no one knows where. He heads to Camelot. There was already another scheme in place. And then Lancelot enters the castle. This is an interesting episode. He is warmly welcomed by King Bedemigu, who was a just and good king and recognized his merit. And the king takes him to the presence of Guinevere. And Guinevere is very harsh with him. She turns to him and says, "You wasted your time. You shouldn't have come looking for me. I don't want to see this knight." And the king himself rebukes her, saying, "But this man gave his life to save you, your majesty. What are you doing?" And Lancelot leaves in a state of total dejection. He thinks about taking his own life. And when Guinevere learns that he is in such a bad state, she goes to him and says, "Remember those 2 steps you hesitated to take towards me. Your decision wasn't complete. There were things behind you to which you were attached. You weren't fully committed to coming towards me." Notice that if she were a physical woman, she would never know this. There she is in the role of a deity, Lady of Life, who does not accept that a man has things that are worth more than this higher spiritual life, this essence, his own. She does not accept that there is anything greater than this sacred center to which every man must serve. The human soul should not have any kind of hesitation when being sought. Then we can remember, for example, of the biblical episode of Lot's wife during the escape from Sodom and Gomorrah, when she looks back and turns into a pillar of salt, because she was not worthy of being saved, as she still had some attachment to what was left behind. Very similar to this, we find in the modern story of the Phantom of the Opera as conceived by Gaston Leroux. The moment when the queen, in this case, who was Chrétien, the crucified opera singer, when she is about to be taken by Eric to the underground, that is, to her essence, to her depths, she looks back, she hesitates. There is still something there that she would like to have. This kind of hesitation for someone who intends to conquer their soul is fatal. It means there are still things behind that can compete with this quest. And this valuing of what was left behind, it can trap us in this experience. The decision must be complete, absolute purity for that man who intends to find and merge with his own soul. And Guinevere acts as a judge of life who does not tolerate hesitations and demands this from him. And Lancelot acknowledges his mistake, doesn't ask anything, doesn't protest, nothing, and asks that God rebuke and condemn him if he ever commits such an act again. And so he redeems himself with Guinevere, but he still cannot return to Camelot. For some reason that isn't very clear, another scheme is devised against him. He is accused of something that leads him to be taken to the dungeons of that castle. Then Gawain arrives, who, after fighting fiercely and almost dying on his own water bridge, was swept away by the current. Almost shipwrecked, but he fights, and is helped by some people on the shore and manages to get to the other side. Almost dead, but he manages to pass this trial of water, which is the energy needed to overcome obstacles. And as soon as he regains consciousness, question where is the queen, and he is taken to the castle. When he arrives, Meriaga had already escaped. The queen already had a safe passage to return to Camelot. Since Lancelot was imprisoned, he returns with the queen. Later, they might think about how to rescue their companion, but at that moment, he immediately returns with the queen to Camelot. Later, Lancelot goes to meet a lady whom he had saved at some point. And this lady, as a form of compensation, also frees him from the dungeon. And he also immediately heads to Castellon. Upon arriving there, he encounters Maleagant and engages in the final battle with him. He kills him and is victorious. And Queen Guinevere, along with all those who were prisoners of the kingdom of death, are returned to Castellon. Look at how interesting this is. What we have seen throughout this sequence with Lancelot is that, in truth, Lancelot is not yet pure enough. But I also warned you that, in various situations in the myth of King Arthur, there is this story of the alter ego, another character who is actually the same as before, just transformed. It's what is called enchantment, transmutation, which Thomas Melody speaks of so well. So you can see that first there was Balaam, who was paralyzed by his anger, his pride, his brutality. Balaam was defeated by his brutality. Lancelot here will be defeated by his passions. And Galahad will be victorious through his selflessness, through his altruism. But deep down, they are a single character who overcomes trials and earns a new name. It's not a new name. He gets closer to hearing his inner name. Until he starts shedding these masks and hears his inner name. And, at that moment, he is worthy of attaining the Grail, of capturing the essence of his spirituality. And to truly become one with the Grail and serve the land. In other words, what Galahad achieves is absolute wisdom. But there was a journey before that. If you remember the story of Elaine that we told, you recall that Lancelot was an absolutely brave and unbeatable knight in battle. Honest and good, but very passionate, with an attachment to material things. Whereas Elaine, daughter of King Celeste, was an absolutely selfless lady. She had everything to be the happiest woman in the world. She was beautiful, she was wise, she was the daughter of a king. And she gives up all of this to fulfill the prophecy. For the birth of the man, the new man, the pure and good man. In other words, when you combine the virtue of courage and bravery of Lancelot with the virtue of renunciation of Elaine, Galahad is born, who possesses the bravery and courage of his father and the renunciation of his mother. That's why he is pure. He is born by merging. He is like a synthesis of these dualities into a single character. So, progressively, what will happen there is a purification, a transmutation. Remember that Lancelot, his baptismal name was Galahad. He bears the name from the baptismal font. And then he receives, from the lady who kidnapped him, Vivian, the name Lancelot of the Lake, because he is raised in the kingdom of the fairies within the lake. As he purifies himself, he does nothing more than return to his origins, to the beginnings, to his name from the baptismal font. He regains the name Galahad in his son, who is himself purified. His son is the fruit of all his effort. And so, Lancelot, with that name, is not capable of the journey towards the Grail. He is not capable of the journey towards the peak of the mountain, towards unity, towards the mystery of divinity itself. But Galahad, who is his son, is detached from everything, from any passion, from any fixation. On earth, he lifts his eyes to the sky and fights for the divine with the same determination that his father fought for the queen. And then, indeed, he achieves this union of the three worlds, which is the representation of the degree. He manages to build a bridge between heaven and earth, between spirit and matter. He is the predestined one, he is the chosen one, he is the 13th knight. Consider that the table only had 12 seats. The 13th is the center. It is the synthesis of the virtues of the entire circumference in a single point. He is the occupant of the perilous seat. He will complete the crossing, started by Balaam, continued by his father, Lancelot, along with the altruism of his mother. It is the synthesis of all this. The pure knight. Selfless, yet at the same time determined, like his father. I think he has his eyes fixed on the celestial. And so we conclude our story for today. Don't forget, next week we have a very interesting episode, Merlin. We'll be there together. Thank you.